The 15th of January 2017 went down in the annals of history. For the first time ever, a keynote speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos was held by a Chinese head of state, Xi Jinping. An extraordinary event. In front of the global business elite, the leader of the world's largest communist country presented the case for strengthening free trade.
我们要坚定不移发展全球自由贸易和投资，在开放中推动贸易。
It was a remarkable feat of public relations, because of course, the Chinese are by no means advocates of unlimited free trade.
China is emphasizing more and more the superiority of the Chinese model.
Xi Jinping is a very clever leader. He takes every opportunity he is given. When there is a vacant space, he will occupy it.
When Xi Jinping addresses the UN or travels to Africa, it's a major event. He has the stature of a great leader.
Spurred on by international focus, Xi Jinping revealed his true intentions.
倡导构建人类命运共同体，促进全球治理体系变革。
We must not forget that Zhang Guo does not mean Middle Kingdom, but center of the world.
In March 2018, Xi Jinping made a surprise announcement. He was amending the constitution and removing the two-term limit on the presidency, allowing him to remain in power for life. This elevated him to the status of Chairman Mao, a first for a Chinese president.
It's an alliance between a dictatorial system and Silicon Valley.
A threat to global civilization.
It's the first time a Chinese leader has exploited China's secretive culture to such an extent.
Xi Jinping's COVID diplomacy goes like this. First, keep everything secret, then deny, then take a position until a strategy is adopted and implemented.
Lockdowns did not stop the Chinese bulldozer from continuing to wipe out the Uyghurs. This is now Chinese history. It's the legacy of Xi Jinping.
When the coronavirus pandemic hit, Xi Jinping sealed off China and went on the offensive. He clamped down on the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement, stepped up the persecution of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and ramped up military threats against Taiwan.
Europe is hiding its head in the sand because it sees the Taiwan conflict as a local conflict. But it would have global consequences because the Americans would intervene.
Never before has China been so powerful and so authoritarian. Never before has China posed such a threat to the balance of global power. Who is Xi Jinping? Where does he come from? And what sort of a world does he envisage? One year after the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic, with the world plunged into crisis and searching for the origin of the virus, Chinese President Xi Jinping felt triumphant.
我们书写了抗疫史诗。中国迄今已向150多个国家提供抗疫援助，积极支持并参与疫苗国际合作。中国将继续同各国分享疫情防控有益经验。我国在世界主要经济体中率先实现正增长。
In this museum exhibit in Wuhan, the city where the outbreak began, Xi Jinping is depicted as a hero in a historic victory, an exemplary leader spearheading a global fight.
Xi Jinping wants to show that China has joined the ranks of global powers and that the Chinese system can now compete with the West's, or even replace it.
China's objective is clear, not to mention Xi Jinping's. The coronavirus crisis was used to demonstrate the efficiency of the Chinese model and to show that it's capable of protecting the population without damaging the economy.
Temporary hospitals were opened. Lockdowns and quarantine rules were strict. Tracking and compulsory mass testing were introduced. Thanks to these measures, said Xi Jinping, he managed to steer China out of crisis and put it back on track.
By locking people inside, you can contain the spread of the virus, sure. We don't know how many people were confined in this way, but Wuhan province alone has a population of 90 million. That's more than France. Just imagine, 67 million people in France locked up for a whole year.
In this exhibition celebrating Xi Jinping, there is no mention of the thousands of COVID deaths in China, of the virus's controversial origins, or of the dates of the first cases. Nor is there any mention of the dozens of people in China who are missing, detained, or imprisoned, including the citizen journalists whose videos at the start of the crisis showed the aggressive nature of the virus and the system's dysfunction in response to it.
我是害怕，我前面是病毒，我后边是中国的法律和行政力量。
There's a lot at stake now for the Chinese government, so when it identifies a source of information, compromising it and challenging the official narrative, it makes sure it disappears.
大家好，我是张展，现在在地西医院。我叫你把手机关了，你不信我就给你发火了。你给我发火吧。
The goal is to highlight China's successes and cover up any mistakes it might have made. China has to transform from the country that might be responsible for the pandemic into the one that is capable of saving the international community.
Xi Jinping says he has won the fight against the virus. But at what cost to the Chinese people and the world population? What is the ideology driving him? His management of the coronavirus crisis could be seen as the perfect illustration of his worldview and the legacy he has sworn to defend. To understand that legacy, one has to understand the Chinese Communist Party. The party that Xi Jinping joined was comparable to joining a religious order. After his appointment as General Secretary in 2012, he came here, to the historic site of the first party meeting in 1921 to be sworn in under the illustrious eyes of the founders of communism.
保守党的秘密，保守党的秘密，为共产主义奋斗终身，为共产主义奋斗终身。
Xi Jinping is a servant of the party mission, almost like being a Catholic priest. So he is highly trained within himself to serve this mission. Is part of a whole system which believes its time has come.
Xi Jinping clearly stated that communism is the only truth. Communism not only has to be the system in China, it must spread around the world.
Xi Jinping will remain the leader of the world's largest communist party for the rest of his life. It boasts over 90 million members, all of whom have sworn loyalty to the party and thus to him above everything else.
What strikes me most about Xi Jinping is his benevolent, affable, open and smiling manner. It's all just a front. He has an iron fist and a velvet glove.
The mask soon began to slip, though. In 2013, his opponents leaked a confidential internal document. Known as Document Number 9, it showed Xi Jinping's predominant ideology.
Shortly after assuming office, Xi Jinping very discreetly circulated a document, the so-called Document Number 9. We heard about it in the spring of 2013. It was a vehement attack on liberal ideas.
And revealed the Chinese leader's true colors. It warned of 7 dangerous Western values that posed a threat to China, including democracy, universal human rights, and freedom of the press.
Document number 9 laid out for the first time the values that Xi Jinping represents. Its publication helped shatter the illusions that some people had about Xi Jinping.
It was clear that his arch-enemies are so-called Western hostile forces. What does that mean? It means that universal values, freedom and democracy, are dangerous. The West is a danger.
We don't realize that criticism of the West is part of China's daily propaganda. They condemn our values and fight against the political ideals we believe in. We're in the middle of an ideological war with the Chinese masses and don't even realize it, because we're not in China and we don't speak Chinese.
The roots of this ideological war and the key to Xi Jinping's personality and motivation lie in his past. His own personal history is closely tied to the history of his country. Because much like communist China itself, Xi Jinping had turbulent origins. Xi Jinping was a Red Prince, the son of an elite Communist Party official. His father was Shi Zhongshun, a communist revolutionary among the first generation of Communist China's leadership, a contemporary of Mao Zedong. Xi Jinping spent the first years of his life in the secluded compound Zhongnanhai, surrounded by party elite.
Xi Jinping was the son of an elite leader, Xi Zhongshun. His youth was privileged in that he was in Beijing, he was at one of the main schools there, but he was also unprivileged. According to the stories, his father was a very harsh father who, made him bathe in cold water and kind of really toughened him up.
But in 1962, when Xi Jinping was 9, his father fell from grace and the family's fortunes declined dramatically. His father was accused by Mao Zedong of plotting against the party, one of the many victims of the leadership purges during the Cultural Revolution. Young Xi Jinping was no longer a princeling. He was now a traitor. At self-criticism meetings, he was forced to denounce his own father. He too became a target of the Red Guard's brutality. There is no reference to these experiences in Xi Jinping's official biography, but they shaped the personality of the future president. In an interview with a Chinese magazine in 2000, he described himself as a survivor. The Red Guards told me 100 times that they would shoot me, he said. They threatened to execute me, and I had to read Mao quotes from morning to night.
He was 9 and didn't understand what was happening. His father had been condemned as a counter-revolutionary, so he had to make up for it by being more communist and more revolutionary than the others in order to survive. To prove that he was a good child of Mao, he redoubled his efforts to study Mao's works. He memorized his speeches until Mao's legacy was deeply rooted in him. Whenever he spoke in Mao's words.
Xi Jinping was confronted with a dilemma: renounce his father and survive, or reject the party and risk execution.
I think the impact on Xi of his father's disgrace was misunderstood. It was feared that he might hold a grudge against the Communist Party, but in fact, this was absolutely not the case. There are two kinds of sons, those who want to take revenge in some way, and those who seek to make amends. He wanted to make up for what had happened, and he raised the stain on the family.
His father was treated abominably during the Cultural Revolution, so he vowed never to become like him. He made Mao Zedong his role model. He didn't want to suffer the same fate as his father.
But a few years later, when he was 15, Xi Jinping suffered a further blow. Along with millions of other young intellectuals, he was sent to work in the countryside to be re-educated, to learn of the hard life there according to Mao's theory. Xi Jinping was sent to a village near the Yellow River, a barren, bitterly poor region. Even there, his father's reputation continued to dog him, and he was labeled an enemy of the people. During the Cultural Revolution, several million Chinese died of exhaustion, starvation, or disease. And thousands, including Xi's older sister, were driven to suicide. But Xi Jinping survived the ordeal.
To describe it in a way that the West can understand, it was similar to the psychological phenomenon of Stockholm Syndrome, when a hostage takes the side of his or her captors. So as not to be a victim, he or she adopts the mindset of the kidnappers. Xi Jinping came to the conclusion that the way to ensure he would never again be a victim was to become powerful. He adopted Mao Zedong's approach. He became, in a way, another Mao.
After his return from exile, Xi Jinping was determined to triumph over his past and rehabilitate his family's honor. Now 22, he began single-mindedly pursuing his goal, a career in politics. With the help of a friend who doctored his file so that his father's past was erased, Xi Jinping was finally accepted for membership in the Communist Party, after being rejected multiple times. When I went to the countryside at the age of 15, I was anxious and lost, he said. When I returned home at 22, I had a clear goal and was brimming with confidence.
It was only because he rose to all these challenges that Xi Jinping was able to rise to become the third great hero of the Chinese Communist Party, after Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. As the proverb says, only when the iron has been put in the fire 100 times does it become steel. I advise all countries of the world to follow China's example. Electing a president by a democratic vote gets you nowhere.
In 1979, Xi Jinping became private secretary to a general who held office in the party's Central Foreign Communications Department. Now 29, he adopted a strategy the Communist Party approved of, working his way out of the countryside and up the political ladder step by step. It was a strategy that would take him all the way to the top.
The party cliques don't usually back strong personalities because the older party officials are less able to keep them under control. They prefer more average types. Xi Jinping was chosen because his career had been in no way remarkable.
To gain the trust of the party's leading officials, Xi turned himself into one of their most loyal servants. By now, he was married to Peng Liyuan, a famous singer in the music corps of the Chinese army. Xi helped raise his profile and improve his style of communication.
She's joked in the Chinese media that she used to be much better known than him because she sang in the choir of the People's Liberation Army.
She's Xi Jinping's calling card. She makes her husband seem more likable.
Xi Jinping cultivated a progressive liberal image that won over the public. In 2007, when the party began looking for a successor to Hu Jintao, the president and general secretary of the Communist Party, they decided that Xi Jinping was an ideal candidate. By November 15, 2012, Xi had beaten out his rivals and was elected to the position of General Secretary of the CCP. The next year, he was elected president. Now that he had fulfilled his personal mission, he set about fulfilling the mission of the Communist Party.
Xi Jinping essaye d'opérer une synthèse entre
Xi Jinping seeks to reconcile imperial and communist history. He wants to give the communist regime a new legitimacy because it no longer has revolutionary legitimacy, as it did under Mao, whose goal was to advance the revolution and establish communism. Nor does it have the legitimacy it had under Deng Xiaoping, who promised the people wealth. A new legitimacy had to be found, and Xi found it in nationalism, a celebration of what makes the country great.
Tout ce qui fait la grandeur du pays.
Xi Jinping sought to rejuvenate the nation and pursue what he called the Chinese dream, a blend of prosperity, unity, and strength. His aim is that by 2049, when China marks its 100th anniversary, the country will be the biggest economic and military player in the world.
中华民族伟大复兴中国梦的时代，是我们日益走进世界舞台中央，不断为人类做出更大贡献的时代。
Previously, the Chinese strategy had been to look unobtrusive, to progress stealthily, and stay under the radar. Xi Jinping was of the opinion that the era of discretion was over, and that China should now publicly aim for a leadership role.
Xi sought to legitimize his nationalist dream by pointing to historical events, such as the series of defeats China suffered in the 19th century and the damage inflicted by the West during the Opium Wars, which had brought about the decline of the Chinese Empire. Imperial China, he said, was humiliated by Britain and other European states and forced to open its market to the opium trade. Millions of Chinese became addicted. The Opium Wars resulted in what became known as the Unequal Treaties, which saw China concede key strategic territories such as Hong Kong and the Shanghai port. To add insult to injury, French and British troops looted and destroyed the old Summer Palace in Beijing.
China really suffered defeat and humiliation again and again, involving many occupation, seizing of the land, setting up concessions, etc. And I would say the Chinese feeling about indignity about all these foreign aggressions is very deeply rooted.
The Chinese dream is born from the roots of Western aggression. This makes it necessary to rebuild our country and make it stronger. We want to return to the greatness of Imperial China.
Xi Jinping's aim of regaining China's lost power involves Chinese unification, a project designed to establish territorial, ethnic, and ideological unity.
According to Xi Jinping's Chinese dream, in his China, there will be only one identity, no more differences. Differences will not be tolerated.
The first step in this unification process is the forced assimilation of the majority Muslim Uyghurs in the immense Xinjiang region. Another goal is to bring Hong Kong into line. Xi Jinping is keen to put a stop to the pro-democracy movement. Ultimately, the president's plan also entails unification with Taiwan, which has been de facto independent for more than 70 years. In his pursuit of these goals, Xi Jinping demands full loyalty from the Chinese public. Since taking office, he has paved the way for a cult of personality.
Xi Jinping will be the great leader who achieved that. We are looking into the eyes in Xi Jinping of someone who believes in an enormous sense of destiny. And that's kind of more intimidating. This story only has one line for him, and it's not for China to fail.
Xi Jinping enlisted one of his most trusted aides to help him achieve his goals. Wang Huning, a veteran party official. As an advisor to the previous two presidents, he knows the inner workings of the party better than anyone. He and Xi Jinping fleshed out a new ideology and a global development plan for China.
Wang Huning extensively studied the question as to whether China should follow a democratic or a totalitarian path. And his conclusions had a major influence on Xi Jinping. In his view, economic and political development can only be achieved with a period of totalitarianism and stability. Social and political progress can wait. That's the fundamental idea.
A brilliant theoretician, Wang Huning convinced Xi Jinping that what China needed was authoritarian leadership. In order to bolster his power, Xi Jinping launched an ambitious anti-corruption campaign. He vowed to fight what he called flies and tigers, lowly bureaucrats and high-ranking officials, in an echo of Mao's infamous purges.
Some of the population were happy about the anti-corruption campaign and welcomed the outing and punishment of corrupt officials, which was also what happened during the Cultural Revolution.
Most Chinese still want a strong leader whom they can revere, like an emperor. For them, that's what Xi Jinping represents. He fights corruption and for the good of the people.
Xi Jinping used the fight against corruption to sideline his political opponents.
In order to consolidate his power, he had to first dismantle existing political structures. Fighting corruption is the most effective way of eliminating a political opponent, because all the big families are corrupt. It's very easy in China to convict someone for corruption.
170 ministers and deputy ministers, 4,000 army officers, and some 100 generals were removed from power in the corruption crackdown.
反腐过程中呢，他清理的光是党员干部
Over 1.5 million party members were purged during the anti-corruption campaign. That's about the population of a small country. It shows what a ruthless dictator Xi Jinping has become.
而且呢，非常的残酷。
The message that Xi conveyed to Chinese society was clear. No transgression of party ideology would be tolerated. Confessions and public admissions of guilt were broadcast on television.
我本身就是一个喜欢炫耀，然后有爱慕虚荣的一个小女孩的心态。
应该在这种敏感的时候。
The cleanup campaign cemented Xi's authority and ensured public support for his historic mission. In this propaganda film, Xi revealed the first phase of his plan: the construction of a new Silk Road, a global infrastructure project spanning multiple countries. It was dubbed the Belt and Road Initiative. Xi Jinping is the first Chinese president in history to launch such a mammoth project beyond his own country. Xi committed $1 trillion to the construction of railroads, ports, and sea routes. First in Asia to close the infrastructure gap, then in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. A project unprecedented in the history of mankind. The primary purpose of the initiative was to accelerate trade, to sell Chinese goods in record time and guarantee growth.
The Belt and Road Project is part of a strategy of bypassing Western powers in order to gradually erode their sphere of influence in the world, starting with Central Asia and moving through Pakistan to East Africa and even onto Eastern Europe.
One Belt, One Road. That's a major strategic vision for President Xi Jinping. It's a long-term plan. We have no long-term plan in the United States or do other Western countries in and of ourselves, let alone vis-a-vis China.
Xi Jinping offered to lend struggling countries the necessary financing for the new infrastructure. About 60 countries signed up, including Sri Lanka, one of the first countries to accept Xi's loan, and then built a huge port in the south of the country.
The people and the country of Sri Lanka benefited a great deal with the construction of that port. Now, I think Sri Lanka is becoming a very active, a very profitable transit port. I think President Xi Jinping is preaching a future vision of the world, whereby all the countries can really join in the megatrend of development, and no country should be left behind.
But despite Xi Jinping's win-win promises, Sri Lanka proved unable to repay its debts. China promptly offered new terms.
Instead of demanding money, Beijing said, "We'll assume control of port activities for the next 99 years." This is an example of a country having to give up part of its sovereignty over important infrastructure.
Xi's Chinese dream turned into a nightmare for Sri Lanka. It not only lost control of its port, but also jobs in the 60-square-kilometer industrial area surrounding it. Adjusting the terms and his tactics, and ignoring protests, Xi Jinping then took his plan to industrialize nations. First, he acquired stakes in strategic infrastructure such as the Greek Piraeus port and Toulouse airport, offering development opportunities in return. Initially, European governments rolled out the red carpet for Xi Jinping, scrambling to meet with him to secure Chinese investment.
C'est un animal politique moderne.
Xi is a modern political animal. He's authoritarian, but he also can be sociable. He shakes hands and tries to promote a particular brand of empathy. He is a 21st century politician. The new Silk Road is a Chinese project for the Chinese, but also for everyone else. There's room in it for us, but of course that aligns with Chinese goals. It effectively creates a continent, Eurasia. Basically, it's a partnership between Asia and Europe, and the Silk Road is the backbone of this new continent. America has long been the center of the world, but now Eurasia will be the center of the world.
It was Germany that raised the first red flag in September 2016 when China acquired a majority stake in the flagship robotics company KUKA. In 2018, during a press conference on security in Europe, then Foreign Minister Sigmar Gabriel dispensed with diplomatic restraint and publicly criticized the Silk Road project.
The new Silk Road initiative is not what many in Germany think it is, a sentimental throwback to Marco Polo. It's an attempt to establish a comprehensive system for reshaping the world to reflect Chinese interests. It's no longer just about economics. China is developing a comprehensive alternative to the Western system, one that is not based on freedom, democracy, and human rights.
Demokratie und individuellen Menschenrechten gründet.
Of course the Chinese want to increase their influence. There's no question. But they also admit that. The only answer is to stick together. If Europe remains divided, it'll be easier for China to find partners.
By 2018, China controlled 10% of European port capacity. In some European countries, economic dependence on China was beginning to slip into political dependence, with Greece seen by many as a Chinese Trojan horse in the EU.
Greece was one of the main beneficiaries of Chinese investment. Piraeus port is now Chinese. In early 2018, for the first time ever, Europe was unable to submit an annual report on the human rights situation in China to the UN Human Rights Council because Greece used its veto.
So they're able to use their economic power to prevent criticism of their own regime. What they want to export is influence. And what they want to get, number one, is silence. They do not want anyone to say anything that is displeasurable. They want acquiescence with their own international policy.
Outside of Europe, Xi Jinping invested primarily in Australia, in all levels of society. Along with New Zealand, it served as a sort of testing ground for the Chinese to experiment with ways of meddling in democracies, using an old strategy to secure political influence developed by the Communist Party.
The Communist United Front tactic entails winning over and neutralizing non-communist forces for its aims. They're won over and turned into allies of the communist cause. China is pulling out all the stops to influence the domestic policies of its foreign partners.
The Chinese influence policy is very active in civil society, in business, in academia.
Elle le fait en influençant les communautés chinoises d'outre-mer.
It influences the Chinese population abroad and finances the election campaigns of China-friendly candidates.
Thank you very much. In late 2017, Australia was rocked by a political crisis that resulted in a senator stepping down from his post after controversy over his ties to Chinese donors.
China managed to bribe a number of members of parliament, who then took China-friendly positions on sensitive issues.
In the wake of the scandal, relations between China and Australia soured.
Australia adopted a number of new measures. For example, it cracked down on party donations from overseas. It also banned Huawei from providing 5G technology for the country's wireless networks.
Tensions between the two countries reached crisis level in May 2020, when Australia called for an international, independent inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. China responded by halting 10% of its imports from Australia. Xi Jinping took a more cautious approach in Europe. He cultivated a network of China-friendly politicians who helped improve the country's image in the West.
One example is former British Prime Minister Cameron. He now holds a management position at an investment fund that supports the Silk Road project. I don't know what his monthly salary is, but it must be substantial.
The Chinese Communist Party maintains relations with politicians all over the world, including in France. Jean-Pierre Raffarin is an obvious example. He's a mouthpiece for China inside of France.
I defend France's interests, but I'm not some naive ideologue who fails to recognize the role that China plays today. 10 years ago, the US was our ally. I predict that in 20 years, as many are saying, our ally will be China.
So far, Xi Jinping's Chinese dream has been most successful in Africa. The new Silk Road now extends across more than half the continent. Xi Jinping is a frequent visitor there, promoting his political dream. He calls it the Chinese solution, a solution based on the principle that the main human right is the right to economic development.
"中非友好，历久弥坚，永葆活力。其根本原因就在于双方始终坚持平等相待、真诚友好、合作共赢、共同发展。"
The Chinese originally went to Africa in search of raw materials. Xi Jinping has since added a further dimension to the Chinese presence in Africa, the China model.
His message is, look, in 30 years we managed to escape miserable conditions and become the world's second largest economic power. We did not follow the same route as the West and open up our political system to democracy. But we are wealthy and highly developed. Our Chinese solution is a success, and you can use it too.
It's a type of authoritarian capitalism, with the state playing a major role by injecting a lot of investment capital. It's a model that works. There's no doubt that China is extremely popular in Africa.
Since 2013, Xi Jinping has lent African nations more than $120 billion. He invests in every aspect of society, from building Africa's longest bridge to hospitals and schools. China has become the main trading partner of the African continent. In order to conquer markets, Xi Jinping offers his African friends much more pragmatic contracts than Western countries.
The major international banks don't approve loans for authoritarian regimes, but China does.
Et la Chine, elle, est d'accord pour le faire.
Le profil du dirigeant idéal pour Xi Jinping, c'est quelqu'un qui
For Xi Jinping, the ideal head of state is a leader who is authoritarian enough to use force to ensure stability, but pragmatic enough to promote economic development and allow society to breathe a bit.
de laisser respirer un peu sa société, etc.
Xi ingratiates himself with Africa by pointing out how the Chinese model is different from the approach taken by colonial powers. He makes it look like he's defending African states against Western imperialism.
共同的奋斗历程，让中非人民结下了深厚的友谊。其根本原因就在于双方。
With Xi as president, China is ideologically much more on the offensive. The Chinese are doing everything they can to point out the flaws in the West, whom they call liberal. China wants to show that its policies are more conducive to economic development. China is using its ties to interfere in the domestic politics of many African states. That's a new aspect of the Chinese presence there.
In just under a decade, Xi Jinping has managed to establish economic and political partnerships with more than half of Africa's nations. To secure trade and investment with Africa, Xi Jinping has crossed a line that none of his predecessors ever dared approach. In Djibouti, East Africa, on one of the world's busiest shipping routes, he has established China's first foreign military base. The opening of the military base on August 1st, 2017, took the world by surprise.
What was striking was how fast China went into Djibouti. The base was installed in just a year. Although China had claimed it had no intention of establishing foreign military bases or of following the American model in any way.
It took everyone by surprise, because Djibouti is a small country with a heavy Western military presence. The Americans, French, Italians, and Japanese are there. That's a lot of people in a small place.
China now has several thousand troops in Djibouti. Xi Jinping is keen to play a role in African security.
China's military base in Djibouti has gotten a lot of international attention, and it's pretty clear to me that probably it would not have been established if, say, the leader was someone other than Xi Jinping. Historically, of course, China has always decried U.S. forward bases and said that China would never repeat this situation, and yet we now see them increasingly doing it. So that's a big change, and it tells us that increasingly we should probably expect more of this type of behavior.
Xi Jinping has said his Chinese dream includes a dream of a strong armed forces. Like Chairman Mao, he believes that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Since Xi has been in power, China has been demonstratively flexing its muscle. The biggest military parades the People's Republic has ever seen have taken place on Tiananmen Square. Xi likes to show the world that China has also caught up on the technology front, unveiling new nuclear deterrents and revolutionary supersonic missiles that can fly under U.S. radar and destroy enemy satellites. In just 4 years, China has built up a fleet of ships and submarines that's now as strong as the French navies.
President Xi pledged to build a world-class army. World-class means it will be the strongest army in the world, even stronger than the U.S. In 2 or 3 decades, there's no doubt that by 2049, our military power will surpass that of the U.S. Paradoxically, China models itself after the U.S., its archenemy, and its powerful military. It emulates America.
On January 3, 2018, the president held his New Year's address in front of 7,000 soldiers. The speech was broadcast in 4,000 barracks across China.
要坚持领导带头，以上率下，坚持实战实训，连战连训，发扬一不怕苦，二不怕死的战斗精神。我宣誓，我宣誓，我从中国共产党的领导，全心全意为人民服务。我从别人坚守敌人，坚守顽强，不怕牺牲，不畏上帝和人，时刻准备战斗，绝不叛逆军队，誓死保卫祖国。
What we are likely to see is a Chinese military that is more capable, more lethal, more expeditionary, and more externally focused. And that's a real challenge that the world is going to have to grapple with.
Xi Jinping has also demonstrated China military might in the South China Sea and the Pacific Ocean, not far from U.S. bases. The U.S. has maintained a strong presence in the region since the Second World War.
After the Second World War, the U.S. occupied the Pacific and surrounded China. It should not have done that. It was devious. In 20 years' time, the U.S. will be forced to withdraw its warships from the region.
Since 2012, Xi has been eyeing the territorial waters and islands of his neighbors, Japan, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam. He lays a historic claim to virtually the entire South China Sea. In late 2017, tensions escalated when China opened military bases on the Spratly Islands and stationed missiles and warplanes there. The U.S. saw this military buildup as a breach of promise.
This is one thing that bothered me about Xi Jinping. When he was in Washington, he was asked, are you going to militarize those islands in the South China Sea? He said, no, I'm not going to do that.
不影响任何国家，也无意搞军事化。
Well, they have. They have militarized those islands in the South China Sea. He just, that doesn't go over very well.
Over the course of several months, we saw constructions appearing on new artificial islands. So everyone was wondering, why? What are they up to?
Little by little, Xi Jinping built a military base in the South China Sea. To this end, several reefs in the Spratly Islands were developed into naval air bases and the Paracel Islands militarized. These developments go against international court decisions, such as the ruling of the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, which in 2016 dismissed Beijing's claim to much of the South China Sea. Beijing refuses to accept the decision. By early 2021, China's preparations for an annexation of Taiwan were complete.
统一是历史大势，是正道；台独是历史逆流，是绝路。我们不承诺放弃使用武力，保留采取一切必要措施的选项。
China's military exercises took place directly opposite Taiwan.
This problem has existed for too long. China should have unified with Taiwan back in 1949. In my opinion, the only solution is a war against Taiwan, a war of reunification.
Parvenir à l'unification.
Unification with Taiwan is essential for Xi Jinping. This goal has become central to the national narrative propagated by the Communist Party.
Imposé par le Parti communiste. Taiwan, c'est le contre-modèle.
For the Chinese Communist Party, Taiwan represents a countermodel that it cannot tolerate. It's proof that a different future, a different political system, and the democratization of Chinese society are possible.
Elle est évidemment possible.
Here at this military base in Inner Mongolia, the Chinese army is believed to have replicated Taiwan's presidential office building and practiced various attack scenarios. Since early 2021, Xi Jinping has been sending more fighter planes and bombers to Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone.
Taiwan is clearly one of their ambitions, not only on the development, the numbers of ships, aircraft, rockets, etc., that they've put in the field, but the way they're advancing those capabilities as well. And I think the threat is manifest during this decade, in fact, in the next 6 years.
Since 1979, Washington has been obliged by law to protect Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion. The region could one day be the backdrop to a standoff between the 21st century's major powers. Now that China has bolstered its military capacity, Xi Jinping is preparing to go head-to-head with the West in international organizations and create a new world order. In order to do so, he's building the influence of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. In June 2018, the SCO summit coincided with the G7 meeting, attended by the world's most important democratic states.
Donc on a les instruments de l'influence chinoise. On a la route de la soie qui est la stratégie.
China's instruments of influence are the New Silk Road, its economic strategy, its political influence extending to the coast of Africa, as well as the political and military alliance, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It all adds to a China-led system that has no precedent in modern times. An alternative to the world order established by the US after the Second World War.
Xi Jinping presided over the summit. By his side, his loyal friend Vladimir Putin, who had been excluded from the G7. Also, the 4 authoritarian republics of Central Asia, and most importantly, 2 new members, India and Pakistan, 2 rival nuclear powers that Xi Jinping had managed to bring to the table.
本次会议是上合组织扩员后 8个成员国领导人齐聚一堂的首次峰会，具有历史性意义。随着成员国数量增加，我们的力量进一步壮大，地区各国人民和国际社会对我们的关注和期待越来越多。
By enlisting countries such as Iran and Turkey as future partners and promising to listen to their concerns, Xi Jinping gave his international summit undeniable legitimacy.
Xi Jinping's strategy for imposing a new world order is to walk on two legs, as Mao once said. On the one hand, he's seeking greater influence in existing multilateral organizations. And on the other, he's establishing new organizations that are influenced not by the West, but by China, and which are ideologically in line with its interests and values.
What better way to neutralize a large institution than to create your own organization to exert pressure? The most extreme example of this is the 16+1 format, with China on one side and 11 Central and Eastern European countries, all EU members, on the other. In addition, there are 5 non-EU countries, making them more vulnerable to China's influence. This is very worrying for the EU, which fears fragmentation.
In the context of the Silk Road, there are over 180 organizations around the world led by the Chinese. They are competing with the United Nations system, and some think this is great.
Xi Jinping's aim is to impose a new world order at the expense of Europe and the US. His vision is of great global unity that has China at its center.
Great global unity means that all the peoples of the world form one big family and enjoy the same prosperity, security, and happiness. Unlike today's world, where the US rules over everyone else, like a tiger devouring sheep.
The Communist Party promises people a bright future and wonderful prospects. But there's a very Chinese calculation behind it. Since Mao, China has been dreaming of building a communist world utopia.
A world founded on one central promise: wealth for all. But to achieve Xi's goal, society must be brought into line and opposition eliminated. Xi Jinping dreams of a world completely under his control. That includes the media. He regularly reminds journalists that they are first and foremost the voice of China.
Good
morning, President Xi. Et là, ce qu'il leur dit tous, il leur dit
He tells everyone, your family is the Communist Party. Never forget that your task is to serve that family. Journalists are not supposed to investigate and inform, but to follow an agenda dictated to them by the party's propaganda department.
For Chinese media, the Xi Jinping era is the worst in 40 years. You rarely find facts in the media now, and certainly no critical statements.
Xi Jinping has dashed all hopes that the country will democratize. From political expression and demonstrations to sexual preferences and religion, everything is state-controlled. Any breach of the Communist Party's ideology is a criminal offense. The slightest misstep is punished. There are now hundreds of thousands of political prisoners in China.
The internet and social media are strictly controlled. For example, anyone who criticizes Xi Jinping on the Chinese app WeChat is immediately arrested.
Like this young woman, who in July 2018 filmed an act of opposition to Xi Jinping and posted it on social media.
看到没有？这是我的行为，反对习近平专制暴政，反对共产党对我实施的脑控压迫。我要求国际组织介入进来。
The video spread across social media, but then it was taken down. The very same day, the young woman managed to photograph the police arriving at her door. Then, she disappeared.
Morally, the party's got a utilitarian ethics, which is 99% of people are probably okay, and the 1% disappear into a black pit. In our societies, would find that problematic. We should be judged by how we deal with the worst, or the people who are most excluded. In the party, that's just collateral. And these people are dealt with very, very brutally.
The repressive tools that Xi Jinping has implemented since he's come into power, whether that be increasing censorship of the Chinese media, internet, human rights lawyers, judicial activists, this is something that Xi very clearly sees as a necessary evil. His general view is that anything that could be seen as challenging Communist Party rule has to be very violently suppressed.
Since coming to power, Xi Jinping has also cracked down on Hong Kong, something no president before him dared to do. The semi-democratic enclave, a remnant of the British colonial era, was previously protected by the rule of law and is now seeing its freedoms increasingly curtailed. Xi Jinping is determined to stake China's claim to the territory. In 2019, he introduced legislation to allow Hong Kong authorities to extradite pro-democracy movement activists to Beijing on any pretext. The move triggered an unprecedented wave of pro-democracy protests.
Xi wants to get rid of this cancer as quickly as possible. It's a very serious crisis that could easily escalate.
Everything that Hong Kong society was founded on in the last decades, freedom in education, freedom of the press, democratic rights, and especially the right to vote, all these values are being challenged.
In 2020, Xi Jinping took advantage of the coronavirus crisis to have the National People's Congress pass a new security law, making it easier to arrest and convict pro-democracy movement leaders.
Increasingly, Chinese law now applies in Hong Kong. Beijing is in the process of annexing Hong Kong, plain and simple.
The judicial system has seriously deteriorated. Our judiciary has become the Communist Party's tool to repress pro-democracy activists. Hong Kong is like a helpless child being constricted to death by a snake.
Hong Kong is increasingly under totalitarian control. Brutal methods of repression are commonplace. Many have decided to flee abroad. It's the only form of resistance left to them.
A year later, China approved changes to Hong Kong's electoral rules. Now, only patriotic MPs will be allowed in Hong Kong's parliament. Candidates first need to be vetted by a pro-Beijing committee to ensure their loyalty to the mainland.
We've seen the same thing happen in Russia. Candidates are selected by an independent committee formed by the Chinese Communist Party. Now they don't even have to bother rigging the elections.
The problems in Hong Kong are not just about this one city. I think Hong Kong is where the battle between the West and China, between democracy and dictatorship, is being fought. If Hong Kong loses, the whole West loses. The whole democratic and free world loses.
Xi Jinping believes in a China united by patriotism and loyalty to the party. A China in which all religious minorities must be incorporated into the dominant culture, either voluntarily or by force. The Xinjiang region in northwest China is home to more than 10 million Turkic-speaking Muslim Uyghurs. They pose a problem for Xi Jinping. The region was annexed by Mao in 1950. 70 years on, the Uyghurs still dream of independence. After a wave of clashes and attacks on the Chinese state, Xi Jinping decided in 2014 to solve the problem once and for all. China's leadership drew up a top-secret plan to crack down on the region's Muslim minorities.
In 2014, Xi Jinping visited the Uyghur region. It was all over the media, especially his visit to the army, where he inspected torture instruments and stressed that any threat to the unity of the country must be eradicated. As a result, the Uyghurs were demonized in China and labeled dangerous, people who must be separated from the rest of the population.
Xi Jinping sent 1 million Chinese officials to Xinjiang to monitor the homes of the Uyghurs, to spy on their daily lives, and report even the most minor deviations from Chinese ideology and culture. 500,000 children are said to have been separated from their families to be put into internment camps. In recent years, over 300 such camps have been built in the region. These function as re-education camps, forced labor camps, and high-security prisons.
How they named these camps is indicative of their propaganda strategy. China doesn't call them camps, but hospitals. When you ask about a person's whereabouts, the answer is often he was sick and had to go to hospital. That is the sort of language they're using. The Uyghurs are considered sick people, infected by the virus of Islam.
Uyghurs are basically being brainwashed in the camps, forced to give up their religion, language, and culture to become part of the Han majority culture. At least 1 million people are thought to have been interred since 2017. Reports of mass rape and torture have surfaced in Western media.
There have been reports that these places are not only internment camps, but places where forced labor and sterilizations are carried out. A cultural heritage is being destroyed with mass surveillance of the local population. These are violations of human rights and potential crimes against humanity.
The US, British, Canadian, and Dutch governments have called the repression of the Uyghurs genocide.
Beijing's current policy in Xinjiang says something about Xi Jinping's personality. He is willing to accept considerable damage to China's image abroad, as well as to relations between China and the West, as a result of this policy.
What is certain is that what the Uyghurs are currently suffering is the world's largest known mass internment since the Second World War.
Since Xi Jinping has been in power, a system of mass surveillance has been established in Xinjiang. It's an experiment that could soon become the norm across China. To ensure the stability of the regime, Xi Jinping wants to become the first head of government in the world to create a monitoring and surveillance system, allowing the state to keep tabs on citizens' daily behavior. To this end, he is currently testing an initiative called the social credit system.
A few years ago, when I left the house, I was often followed by a car. That's changed. Because now, cameras and surveillance systems can follow your every movement. They know exactly where I've been. Big Brother is now everywhere, monitoring every place at any time. It's the eye of the government.
New facial recognition software immediately assigns a name and personal data to every image. Officially, all Chinese people are registered in this software.
There are no restrictions in China. There's no data laws, really. They're not really observed. The party has the total freedom to open this space up, to go in and do what it could never do before, which is to go into the inner lives of Chinese people.
Each citizen has a total of 1,000 points in his or her points account. For each action in their personal or professional life, on their bank account or social media, the system imposes a penalty or issues a reward in the form of point gains or losses.
The social credit system is a system where basic information about all citizens will be contained in a register, enabled to evaluate whether they are good citizens or bad citizens. Now, it's a wonderful instrument of control. For example, it is now being used to decide who will be allowed to travel and not to travel abroad or within the country.
If your score is bad because you criticized the president on social media or behaved in an undisciplined manner at work, you'll be barred from certain professions. You can't become a teacher or a police officer or a party official or an executive in a company.
During her visit to China in May 2018, then German Chancellor Angela Merkel expressed grave concern about the social credit system, referring to George Orwell's chilling vision of the future.
This issue will decide the fate of the whole planet because the Chinese will one day want to expand this technology abroad.
Social media companies like Facebook follow China's orders. 2 days ago, I published a critical text about the Communist Party on Facebook, without hate comments or calls for violence. But I still received a message from Facebook telling me that my account was suspended for 24 hours. So even though I live in the US, I am not allowed to criticize the Chinese Communist Party without restrictions. The party has already begun to weaken human rights and freedom of expression around the world.
A law passed in 2017 requires Chinese telecommunications companies operating overseas to cooperate with Chinese intelligence agencies and keep the cooperation secret. Concerned about spying, the US, Sweden, and Britain have barred Chinese groups from rolling out their 5G networks. Step by step, Xi Jinping is pursuing his plan to make China the world's largest economic, technological, and military power.
After testing President Xi Jinping, he's been generally accepted as a very strong and capable leader, a well-respected leader, and we do not want to lose this chance. We want to keep him there for longer, for more years. And hopefully he can continue to make contribution to China and also to the rest of the world.
While the majority of the Chinese population seems to believe in the Chinese dream that Xi Jinping has promised, the international community has come to see the true face of the Chinese president and his regime. For the first time, the community is officially demanding clarification on a number of important issues, starting with COVID-19, which began in China and caused millions of deaths worldwide. A year and a half after the outbreak of the global pandemic, China has still not explained why it was so late to warn the global community about the highly contagious virus and why misleading information was circulated about its origin.
This is perhaps the first time in the last 2 to 3 decades that China has engaged in a disinformation campaign, a campaign of rumors and misinformation to waste the time of foreign governments.
A fact-finding mission by WHO experts in Wuhan was strictly controlled by the party and proved unsuccessful. The origin of the virus remains a mystery. The international scientific community has appealed to China to disclose all its data on various hypotheses, including the lab leak theory.
As I have said, all hypotheses are on the table and warrant complete and further studies from what I have seen so far.
Pour la Chine, la piste de l'accident de laboratoire est évidemment extrêmement...
For China, of course, the lab leak theory is extremely problematic because it calls into question the entire national narrative and could turn China from the savior of the world to the country responsible for the pandemic.
At the first meeting between the Biden administration and the Chinese government in Alaska in March 2021, the atmosphere was frostier than ever.
Two of our nation's closest allies. Today, we'll have an opportunity to discuss key priorities, both domestic and global. We'll also discuss our deep concerns with actions by China, including in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, cyber attacks on the United States, economic coercion toward our allies. Each of these actions threaten the rules-based order.
任何诋毁中国社会制度的做法都是徒劳的。美国有美国式的民主，中国有中国式的民主。
For the first time, we're dealing with a leader and powerful country. China is the second largest economy and a highly armed military power that dare to go its own way. Until now, authoritarian regimes have always claimed to respect universal human rights. Xi Jinping says no, human rights don't apply in China. Don't try to convince us. We stand by our policy.
I've known Xi Jinping for a long time. Doesn't have a democratic with a small d bone in his body, but he's a smart guy.
A power struggle is now underway between China and the West, where democracies will need to stand up to China and defend their values. Along with the US, Canada, and the UK, the EU has imposed the first sanctions on China since the Tiananmen Square massacre, a response to the oppression of the Uyghurs.
There will be no change in the European determination to defend human rights and to respond to serious violations and abuses where they are committed.
In light of the threats against Taiwan, Joe Biden has stepped up military maneuvers in the Indo-Pacific in alliance with Japan, Australia, and India.
The assumption that a conflict in the Taiwan Strait would be limited to China and Taiwan is a misconception. In fact, this would be a global conflict, or at the very least, a conflict with global consequences.
China is also stepping up joint military exercises with Russia and its new allies.
在二战的前夕，那么是希特勒是法西斯主义
Before the Second World War, Nazism and fascism were a threat to the world. Today it is China that challenges the democratic world. With a blend of fascism, traditional imperialism, and technological totalitarianism. When you consider that China has the world's second largest economy, the largest population, the fourth largest territory, and the largest authoritarian party, it becomes clear why this is the greatest threat since World War II.
If Xi Jinping succeeds in creating his new world order, the future of the world will be decided by an authoritarian regime.